My name is Karla Silva, and I am currently an undergraduate student at the University of Texas at Arlington. I have been working under Dr. Peter Kroll and Dr. John Lang for the past 5 weeks. And my project has been the size evolution of pre-ceramic gels investigation by dynamic light scattering. Now, in our lab, we work with aerogels. And while we know that these polymers end up cross-linking to form these aerogels, what we don't know is how the size of these particles changes. We don't know if this particle or these polymers continue to grow and just never precipitate out anything, or if maybe they cross-link and at some point they start precipitating out some particles, denoted by these particles here in purple, or if maybe it just grows to a certain point and then stops growing. So this is what we don't know, and that's the purpose of my project, is to analyze the size evolution of these particles. And now this is done using dynamic light scattering. And another portion for my project is to eventually study how different solvents affect the growth rate or morphology of the aerogel formation. Now, a little bit of background on dynamic light scattering, otherwise known as DLS, is that basically what occurs here is you have a laser, a sample, and a detector. Now, pardon me if you cannot see my pointer, but essentially what happens here is you have a laser and it emits the light towards the sample, which then scatters the light in all directions. What we do is we set this detector here, mine is at 90 degrees, and this detector then measures the fluctuations in intensity, and using some software and some programming, it then gives the diameter of whatever particle is inside the sample. So if there's multiple particles, it'll give multiple diameters. And now, as I mentioned before, I work with aerogels, and the way we synthesize these aerogels is by adding polymethyl hydroxyloxane, otherwise known as PMHS, with divinyl benzene, otherwise known as DVB, into a vessel along with the catalyst, which is a platinum catalyst, and a solvent. In this case, it's acetone. And what occurs is we end up with a polymer with the unit that's represented here on the right. Now, this is typically conducted at 150 degrees Celsius for 6 hours. Notice how I said typically, because for my case, it is quite a bit different. So I've actually been working on determining when is the best time, and I'll talk a little bit about this next. So as I mentioned before, we typically run them at 150 degrees Celsius for 6 hours. Now this results in a gel that is completely solid. So I can't really analyze that with the DLS, at least not at this moment. So what I did was I started experimenting and seeing which time frame would probably be the best one to analyze. Now here on the left, I have pretty much all the reactants and the solvent in a vessel before they are put into the oven. And here on the right, here at the very top, is the reaction that was allowed to sit for 150 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes in the oven. Now visually, I can't really see a difference. And this was also the case for the next thing that I tried, which was to then lower it to 50 degrees Celsius and run it for 4 hours. I also ran this reaction at 150 degrees Celsius for 1 hour. And as you can see here in the middle picture on the right, it's already fully cross-linked. So again, it's solid. At the moment, I cannot really analyze it. But what I did notice is from the top picture here, the one that was run at 150 degrees Celsius at 30 minutes, as well as the one that was run at 50 degrees Celsius for 4 hours, is that the following days, I could see this gel. Now, the first one that was run at 150 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes, that took several days. It took actually a whole weekend for it to become a gel. But the second one, the one that was run at 50 degrees Celsius for 4 hours, became a gel overnight. I essentially left it, came in the next morning. I was planning on checking if anything had occurred using the DLS, And it was a little too late because a gel was already there. However, the main takeaway from this was that the reaction proceeds even without the vessel being at a high temperature. So this was something that was very interesting to me because then it helped me see that, hey, this is worth looking into with the DLS because something could be happening. Now, as I mentioned, I then remade the batch, another batch, and I analyzed them using the DLS. Now here on the y-axis, we have our intensity, and on the x-axis, we have our diameter. Now, when I ran the aerogel that was reacted for 3 hours, I could see that there was 3 different peaks in my plot. One corresponded to 7.91 nanometers, the other one to 22.9 nanometers, and the other one to 135 nanometers, which was great. It was indicative that there is something in my sample. Now, the one that was run for 4 hours at 50 degrees Celsius also had 3 peaks. One at 5.73 nanometers, another one at 12.6 nanometers, and finally the last one at 82.2 nanometers. Now, this looks very similar to the one that was 3 hours. So again, I was very excited that I had particles inside my sample, but then the question popped into mind, well, is anything happening? And how do you tell? So what I did was I ended up using the DLS on every single component individually. So this is what happened. Now, I ran the DLS through the dried acetone because that is typically what we use. We want our acetone to be as dry as possible. Now, what I noticed is I had peaks, and I was not expecting peaks. So in our intensity versus our diameter, I had 2 different peaks, one at 260 nanometers and the other one at around 300 nanometers. And this was a sign that there was particles already in my acetone, which was not the best thing to happen. And by volume, it just means that what was mostly present in the sample was the one that was 250 nanometers. That's all the volume by diameter plot is telling us. Now, what I did notice is that the way we dry our acetone is by adding zeolite beads into it. Well, what I think happened is these zeolite beads precipitated out some particles into the acetone, and that was what was being picked up by the DLS. So then I thought, well, what should I do? So I thought about filtering it. Then the filters weren't going to come in time, and I wanted to really just see if anything was happening. So what I did was I ended up using acetone in its pure state, not dried, nothing done to it. And as you can see, there's no peaks. This is exactly what I wanted. It makes it a lot easier for me to determine if anything's happening in the aerogel. And it also shows that there's nothing that shouldn't be in my reaction. So what I did was I used the acetone that was not dried for the rest of the reactions, including the ones with the aerogels that I just showed. And so for the platinum catalyst, I had a peak at around 5.75 nanometers in my intensity versus my diameter. And then I also ran the PMHS, and I had 2 different peaks, which at first I did not expect. But then I found out that PMHS tends to be a little unstable. And so what I'm thinking happened is that while this first peak might actually be the PMHS, what I'm thinking actually happened is that this PMHS began to aggregate as I put it in the acetone, making bigger clusters. So that is why I think there is a peak at 410 nanometers. The same thing happened with my DVB. I had a peak at 7.38 and 149 nanometers. And again, I think it just began to aggregate as I put it in the acetone. Now, what running the DLS on the individual components tells me is that, unfortunately, I do not think a reaction actually happened. I don't think anything really changed because here again, I have this one's from the 3-hour reaction, and I have about the same peaks as the individual components, one at 7, one at around 80, and the other one at 135, which was all the components. And so unfortunately, I do not think that anything happened. However, I am still working on modifying what timeframes to analyze. And I think I'm pretty confident that I can get that pretty soon, and that way I can start really working on it a little bit more. And after that, I plan to change the solvents. The immediate one that I'm thinking of is cyclohexane, and I'll see if that has any effect. And I'm also thinking about potentially exploring my aerogels, or at least the ones that I've run, with separation chromatography, just to verify that I do indeed have different particles in there. And so that's pretty much it. Thank you so much for your time. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thank you so much.